Hi, I'm Marcel-Jan. In 2013, I visited a museum that for a long time was on my bucket list, the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum in Washington D.C. I like spaceflight, and this museum has such an amazing collection of spaceflight pieces. It just blows the mind. From here on, all pictures are done by me. But first of all, the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum also houses the first aircraft ever built. That's right, the airplane built by the Wright brothers. On December 17, 1903, they flew this plane from Kitty Hawk in North Carolina, and at the end of the day they managed to fly for 1 minute and cover 260 meters of distance. You'll find this plane in a special room on the second floor. Once you are in the museum, you'll find all kinds of historic planes and spacecraft. For example, the Spirit of St. Louis, with which Charles Lindbergh flew over the Atlantic Ocean. He wasn't the first one to do this, by the way, but he was the first pilot to do this solo. Chuck Yeager was the first to fly through the sound barrier with this plane, the Bell X-1. It was something that was believed to be impossible. But let's start at the beginning of the entrance hall, just when we enter. The entrance is free, by the way, but you have to go through security. This museum is very close to the White House and the American Congress. Robert H. Goddard invented the liquid multi-stage rocket, an invention essential to later spacecraft endeavors. Nowadays, many rockets use the same principle. His first liquid-fueled rocket from 1926 is not in this museum, and I'm not sure if it still exists, but there are several other rockets here that he made. This spacecraft, the Mercury Friendship, was launched on one of those multi-staged liquid-fueled rockets, making John Glenn the first American astronaut in orbit. You can have a look in the capsule, but the plexiglass makes it a bit hard to photograph the insides. Close by we'll also find the Gemini 4 capsule. From this spacecraft, Ed White became the first American spacewalker in 1964. Once again the Soviets managed to beat the Americans to it only 3 months before. But it actually was with this spacecraft that the Americans managed to take the lead in the space race. In the spacecraft there was room for only 2 astronauts. And you can see how small it was compared to the visitors around it. Now imagine the 2 astronauts, Ed White and John McDivitt, staying in here for 4 days, in their spacesuits. And on Gemini 7, Frank Borman and James Lovell flew in this small space for almost 2 weeks. In the center of the hall we'll find, yes, the capsule of Apollo 11. It was this capsule that brought Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin and Michael Collins back to Earth from the moon, where Armstrong and Aldrin became the first humans to land there. And the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum has so many other stuff from Apollo 11 and the other Apollo missions. For example, the moonsuit of Buzz Aldrin, which you will find on the second floor. They also have the suit with which Neil Armstrong took the first step on the moon, but that's stored under special conditions in a depot of the Smithsonian. Recently money was raised in a Kickstarter project to 3D scan that moonsuit. And here we find Spaceship One, the space plane with which skilled composites managed to win the X Prize in 2004. To win the prize they had to launch this spaceship twice above 100 kilometers within 3 weeks. I'm a great fan of planetary spaceflight. This is the test model of the Viking landers that made soft landings on the planet Mars in 1976. This model is basically the same as the 2 landers that are on Mars. NASA engineers used this model to test scenarios before they tried them on the real landers. You'll find many of such test models in this museum. This satellite isn't a model. It actually had to become Pioneer H, or 12, and should have been launched in the 70s of the last century over the poles of the Sun, which we can't see from Earth. But NASA didn't have enough budget to launch it. It looks very similar to Pioneer 10, that was the first human-made object to visit Jupiter and pass the orbits of Neptune and Pluto. It was said it left the solar system, but actually there are several ways to define the edge of the solar system. There are many objects here that have been in space and came back to Earth, but there aren't many objects that have flown in the trail of a comet for a while and then came back. This is the Stardust return capsule. That tennis racket-like device was used to pick up comet dust in a material called aerogel. The aerogel is no longer here. It's stored under special conditions in the Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas, because it contains precious comet material. Comets are believed to be the remnants of the early solar system and often contain organic materials. If we move left from the main entrance, we'll come in the Space Race Hall. In the center of this is the missile pit with several rockets. The Jupiter 1 that launched Explorer 1, not the same rocket of course, a Scout D rocket, and several missiles and sounding rockets. Prominently visible here also is the model of the Skylab space station that flew in the 70s of the last century. It was launched on the last Saturn V rocket. Actually, the real Skylab space station would be probably at least a story higher. And of course, this was also a model the astronauts trained in, and you are allowed to have a look inside. Here is the home trainer, and here's the shower. And did you know that the International Space Station doesn't have a shower? It turned out it wasn't that practical showering in space. Only the first Skylab crew of 3 used it. And here's where the astronauts would eat. Skylab was planned to be visited by the Space Shuttle in 1979, but eventually the shuttle wasn't ready until 2 years later. By then Skylab had burned up above Australia in July 1979. Quite a tight planning actually. Here in this hall you also find an Apollo spacecraft, docked to a Soviet Soyuz, as they were in 1975. It was called the Apollo-Soyuz Test Project. During the flight, the astronauts and cosmonauts met and ate meals together. Even so, back then they probably never imagined that Americans and Russians would later build a space station together. And the current version of that Soyuz still brings American, European, Japanese and Russian crews to that station. This model of the Hubble Space Telescope really looks like the real one in space. Just search on the internet for pictures of the Hubble repair missions and you'll see they're very similar. That's because this one is a test model astronauts trained on, but it gets even better. During those repair missions, astronauts removed some scientific instruments and placed newer ones. One of these instruments brought to Hubble in 1993 was essential. That was because Hubble's primary mirror had an optical defect called spherical aberration. This CoStar instrument was placed to solve that, and it did so until it was replaced in 2009 by a newer instrument. CoStar worked very well because with it Hubble started to produce sharp images of the cosmos. And here it is, back on Earth after 16 years. There actually was a backup mirror made by Kodak and it didn't have that defect. But the primary mirror just happened to be one of the things that could not be replaced. That backup mirror is also in the museum, on the 2nd floor. You also find the Wide-Field Planetary Camera 1 and the Faint Object Spectrograph, both instruments that were replaced on Hubble and brought back home. That enormous light bulb on the right is actually one of the 11,000 detectors of the Kamiokande neutrino detector in Japan. The last thing you would expect to see in a museum is a spy satellite. Okay, this is one from the 50s and 60s of the last century, but still, the Discoverer Corona satellite didn't have any radio downlink to Earth to share the photos taken. Instead, films were spooled on a re-entry capsule. The capsule would then be picked out of the air by an aircraft. 114 of these missions were launched and 102 returned usable photos. The Soviets had something similar on their manned space stations Salyut 3 and 5. They could send photos back to Earth in capsules like these. This museum also has a great collection of artifacts from the beginning of the space race. Let me take you back to 1957. The Soviets launched Sputnik 1, the first orbiting satellite. The Americans tried to follow. The American Navy and Air Force both had a project to launch a satellite. The Navy had Vanguard, with this baseball-sized satellite, the Vanguard TV-3. The launch on December 6th took only 2 seconds before the rocket exploded and the satellite tumbled off the rocket and on the launch pad. It survived, and that's why we find it here in the museum. Back when I went to this museum in 2013, there was an exhibition about spacesuits. It's possible there's something that replaces it now. Before the Soviets dared to launch a human into space, they had to test their Vostok spacecraft. On the last 2 test flights this dummy flew and a dog. The dummy, called Ivan Ivanovich, the Russian equivalent of John Doe, looked so much like a real pilot the engineers decided to print the word dummy on its forehead. Weeks later, Yuri Gagarin became the first human being in space. Here we see spacesuits from John Glenn, the real deal, and Yuri Gagarin side by side. Now you might be forgiven in asking how it ended up here in Washington D.C. It turns out it's a training version of the suit. The suit Gagarin wore on his flight is of course in Moscow. Alexei Leonov made the first spacewalk in a spacesuit like this. The only thing was, he had a hard time getting back into the capsule through the inflatable tunnel. This was because his spacesuit ballooned against the vacuum of space. If he would not have made it back into the capsule, his fellow cosmonaut Pavel Belyayev would have to leave him behind. Eventually Leonov managed to return after leaving air out of his spacesuit. Because of that he was very close to decompression sickness. But he made it. And if that wasn't enough, the capsule landed in Siberia in an area with hungry bears and wolves. Eventually Americans would win the space race with the Apollo project. Here's the moonsuit of Apollo 15 astronaut Dave Scott. You can still see the moon dust on it. Moon dust is much sharper than dust on Earth because it hasn't been eroded by erosion. It's dangerous for equipment, but also humans. The Soviets never told they had plans to go to the moon also, but after the Cold War ended it was eventually revealed they had test versions of a lunar lander and a moonsuit. In the end, the Soviets didn't make it to the moon because of several factors. First, they bet on 2 moon rockets. Then they didn't have the funds for both, and when they eventually went along with the N-1 rocket, it kept failing. And here's a spacesuit from the shuttle era. This one was worn on STS-128, a flight to build the International Space Station. If you walk to the end of this wing of the museum, you'll see several items from the time of the race to the moon. This one is the Ranger probe. It was supposed to crash on the moon, and on the way it had to take pictures. That happened to be quite a challenge. The first 5 Rangers either didn't survive launch, they missed the moon, or they didn't send images back before they hit the moon. Eventually Ranger 7 was a success. The 5 lunar orbiters that mapped the moon in preparation of the Apollo program was a lot more successful. Lunar Orbiter 1 made the first photograph of the Earth from the moon, and Lunar Orbiter 2 made a beautiful oblique picture of the crater of Copernicus that was called the Picture of the Century in 1966. A couple of former NASA employees started digitizing these lunar orbiter images from old computer tapes. They managed to find one of the last remaining tape drives and process the data on modern computers, gaining images with much higher resolution than was possible back then. Check it out on moonviews.org. In 1966, the Soviets managed to beat the Americans once again with the first unmanned soft landing on the moon. The Surveyor landers were America's program to test unmanned lunar landings. Surveyor 1 touched down only 5 months after the Soviets landed Luna 9. The arm on this lander was only used to dig in the soil to find out its consistency. It all led to the manned lunar landings. The model you see here would actually have been launched on an unmanned flight after Apollo 5, but the test of the lunar module on Apollo 5 was successful enough that it was decided that the next test flight wasn't needed. Maybe also because they were a bit in a hurry. Later on, astronauts used this model to train on for their missions to the moon. After the Apollo program, for a long time the moon was not a topic of study for space missions. It was only in the 90s that Clementine was launched to map the moon's minerals. It was also planned to visit an asteroid after that, but a computer issue made that impossible. On the left-hand side of the lunar lander we find a room dedicated to the space shuttle. Many designs were tested before the eventual design of the space shuttle with an external fuel tank and 2 solid fuel boosters came out. In hindsight, some of the designs would have been safer, like the ones where the shuttle would have been placed on the first stage, on top of the rocket. Of course, there's a model of the space shuttle as it actually was launched 135 times. There's also a version of the engines of the shuttle. Parts of this engine have flown on several shuttle flights, among which the first 4. The shuttle program made way for astronauts with different backgrounds than test pilots. Scientists flew on many shuttle flights. Sally Ride became the first American woman in space, and Guy Bluford became the first African-American astronaut. And these were the suits they wore during their first flight, so also during launch and re-entry. NASA thought that a pressure suit wasn't necessary anymore. After the Challenger accident, this all changed. I've been always fascinated by the science experiments in space, especially when I followed a laboratory study. It turns out not every astronaut shared that interest. In the book Riding Rockets by astronaut Mike Mullane, I read that many pilots actually rather not be selected for space lab missions. It had something to do with flying pee and poo of lab animals, amongst other things. On the left you see a model of a space lab laboratory, and on the right you see an instrument for growing protein crystals. Protein crystals are used to learn what the protein structure looks like. From this information, new drugs can be developed. Protein crystals can be grown much easier in zero gravity. In this museum we will not only find aircraft and spaceships, but also instruments that have been important for the field of astronomy. For example, this is the observing cage of the 100-inch Hooker telescope of the Mount Wilson Observatory. For a long time it was the largest telescope in the world. It was Edwin Hubble who managed to find out with this telescope that the universe is much larger than our own galaxy, and that there are other galaxies moving away from us. This later led to the Big Bang theory. Observers were often working long, cold nights to keep the telescope accurately aimed so that sharp images or spectrographs could be made of distant objects. Here's a spectrograph used on the Lick Observatory in California. With spectrographs you can separate the light in different frequencies, like a rainbow from visible light. From this, astronomers can learn what the planets, stars and nebulas are made of. It can also be used to find out if an object is moving toward us or moving away from us, thanks to the Doppler effect. Objects moving away from us are slightly redder in color, the so-called redshift. In this exhibit there is a telescope that has been in space twice. This is the Hopkins Ultraviolet Telescope, which flew as part of 2 Astro missions on the Space Shuttle. After 1 and 2 weeks respectively, it was brought back to Earth. I never found out why they didn't just made it into a satellite. 3 weeks is a bit short for observing time. A completely different type of telescope is this one, the Wilkinson Microwave Anisotropy Probe, WMAP. It was used to map the microwave background radiation of the universe. This is the oldest light of the universe that is visible in some way. Its observations were used to form a new standard model of cosmology. When I visited the Smithsonian, there was an exhibition about navigation, from navigation on the stars in the time of Columbus to the modern use of GPS satellites. A completely different challenge is navigating a satellite to the planets. This is a spare version of the Mariner 10 that flew past Venus and Mercury. Fans of the Apollo program will not be disappointed here. There are so many artifacts from the Moon program. Displays show everything from spacesuits to sample bags to toothbrushes and shaving cream used by the astronauts on their flights. I like this ultraviolet telescope flown on Apollo 16. This is the technical model of the one still on the Moon. It was used to observe the highest layers of the atmosphere of our planet. On the last 3 Apollo flights there was a lunar rover the astronauts could use to travel much further from the landing site. This is of course a flight-ready version of it and one of 8 lunar rovers ever made. With this rover, astronauts have driven tens of kilometers to explore their surroundings. On Apollo 17 they had to do a little bit of repair. Part of the fender broke off, and when the astronauts started driving, they got a lot of moon dust over them. So they repaired it with duct tape and moon maps, and that worked. For some reason they took the maps back home, and they are now here in the museum. This is the panel used to control the Apollo command module. On the left hand side you see a section with black keys. This was the guidance computer used on Apollo flights. It was used to calculate burns of the engines and other stuff. This was one of the first computers based on an integrated circuit or a microprocessor. The software was programmed under the guidance of Margaret Hamilton from MIT. It just goes to show you that women have done a lot more in IT than you think. During the flight, the spacecraft needed electrical power. The Apollo command module used a fuel cell, which could use the hydrogen fuel and oxygen to generate power, but also water, which could be applied as drinking water. And this is the hatch of the Apollo 11 capsule. After the Apollo 1 disaster, its design was changed so it could be operated faster from the inside. As if one Apollo capsule isn't enough, the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum has a second one. This is the capsule from the Skylab 4 flight, and it can be found on the second floor. Does this museum have a collection or what? After the Apollo program, no new manned space flights outside low Earth orbit were undertaken, but unmanned probes like Voyager 1 and 2 showed us what the planets and moons looked like. This is an engineering model of the Voyager probes that visited Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus and Neptune. Voyager 1 became the first man-made object that went outside the heliosphere and into interstellar space. I think I like this object the most from the museum. This is the TV camera of the Surveyor 3 lander that landed in 1967 in Oceanus Procellarum. In 1969, Apollo 12 landed close to it, detached the camera and brought it back to Earth. So that means it's the only human-made object that has stayed on the moon for 2 years and was then brought back. When the camera was studied, a surviving bacterium was found, a Streptococcus mitis. It's a bacterium commonly found in the human mouth. However, the claim was later challenged. It's quite possible someone sneezed on it after it came back. Of course, there's also a model of the successful Mars exploration rovers here, better known as Spirit and Opportunity. Opportunity is already operating almost 12 years on Mars, Earth years, much longer than the initial planned 90 Mars days. At this moment, the Mars rover Curiosity drives on Mars with a laboratory on board, but Curiosity is not the first mission to have a laboratory on board. In 1976, the 2 Viking landers had this instrument package on board. It has a gas chromatograph, something to separate chemicals, and a mass spectrometer to identify the chemicals. I've worked with instruments like that on a laboratory, and I can tell you, those didn't fit in a shoebox like these one. At an exhibition on rocket pioneers, I found this model. It shows how Russian educator Konstantin Tsiolkovsky envisioned how a spaceship would look like back at the end of the 19th century. The designers of the Sputnik rocket and satellite, Korolev and Glushko, Tsiolkovsky's material intensively and brought his theories to reality. From Tsiolkovsky is the quote, "The Earth is the cradle of humanity, but one cannot remain in the cradle forever." And with that, I think I've shown the most interesting spaceflight related artifacts in this building, as I've seen them in 2013. Of course, that's a lot more on aviation. Let me just give you some of the highlights. Here's the Lockheed Vega 5B aircraft of Amelia Earhart, with which she managed to break several records. With it she flew solo over the Atlantic Ocean and over the United States. After all these spectacular planes, rockets and spacecraft, I wasn't surprised anymore to see a DC-3 plane hanging from the ceiling. This is the Hall of America by Air, and it shows the development in civil aviation. A Boeing 747 was just a little bit too big for this hall, so we only see the front. Drones now also have a place in the museum. Remarkable what they're showing here, like this stealth drone, the X-45A. And here is a human-powered airplane. The Gossamer Condor. Its successor, the Gossamer Albatross, managed to cross the English Channel. So that's my tour of the many spacecraft, space probes, rockets and some aircraft of the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum. I hope you've enjoyed it. But don't think you've seen it all now, because the Smithsonian also has a companion facility to this museum. the Stephen Udvar-Hazy Center near Dulles International Airport. It basically consists of 2 large hangars, and I visited this center also. I hope I'll be able to show this center in a video in the near future. If you want to know more about the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum, visit airandspace.si.edu.